Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're retaking a quiet journey into the flickering heart of medieval Europe, into a city where gold shimmered like prayer and a single family's ledger would one day decide the fate of popes, kings, and empires. So pull the blanket a little closer, let the room grow still. The candlelight of Florence awaits. By watching this video, you'll learn how the Medici family rose from humble merchants to become the secret bankers of Europe, how they built cathedrals from credit, turned coins into power, and reshaped faith itself through the language of money. It doesn't begin with kings or knights. It begins inside a small Florentine workshop where Giovanni de Medici bends over his wooden desk. Beside him, a candle flickers, lighting piles of parchment covered in numbers and names. The smell of melted wax and ink fills the air, and outside the window, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore echo across the sleeping city. Here, in this quiet room, a merchant's hand moves carefully across the page. And with every line he writes, the first heartbeat of modern banking begins. Before we begin, a small note. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, I upload new videos every day, so consider subscribing and turning on the bell. Join us in this nightly voyage through time and sleep, and tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love imagining people drifting off to the same story under different skies. Now let's step softly into the golden dusk of Florence. In the 14th century, Florence was a city of contradictions, rich and restless, faithful and cunning. It stood at the crossroads of trade routes that carried silk, wool, and silver across Europe. Its narrow streets smelled of leather, spice, and smoke, and its citizens walked with a strange confidence, the feeling that their small city might soon become the center of the world. Among them were merchants who thought differently. They saw that wealth did not have to rest in chests or vaults. It could travel in letters, promises, and numbers, in trust. And from that fragile idea, the world's first great banking network would be born. At the heart of it all stood the Medici family. Giovanni de Medici, the quiet founder, began not as a prince or nobleman, but as a money changer in the market stalls near the Ponte Vecchio. His hands handled coins worn thin by trade, stamped with faces of kings he would never meet. Yet within those coins he saw something more, the future itself. Each evening, as the bells tolled vespers, he would close his books and whisper a prayer that balanced both heaven and profit. For in Florence, money was a sin, but also a salvation. The church forbade usury, lending with interest, yet the city's very heartbeat relied on it. Merchants found ways to bend faith without breaking it, disguising interest beneath layers of trade contracts and exchange rates. And in the glow of candlelight, numbers began to breathe. In the dim counting houses along Via Porta Rossa, apprentices shuffled parchment sheets, dipping quills into ink pots black as the Arno at night. Wax seals glimmered, stamped with the family crest, 5 red balls on a field of gold. Each document carried a promise that somewhere across the sea, another Medici branch would honor the same debt, the same faith in invisible wealth. Florence was alive with whispers of fortunes made and lost before sunrise. The flicker of candles revealed faces deep in concentration, shadows moving across wooden tables as merchants read letters from Bruges, Venice, or Rome. These were the veins of Europe's hidden economy, pulsing beneath marble cathedrals and beneath the quiet eyes of priests who pretended not to notice. Gold was no longer just a metal. It had become a belief. The Medici understood that power could be silent, that a well-timed loan to a prince was worth more than 1,000 swords. They learned to turn generosity into influence, to dress ambition in the robes of charity. They funded altarpieces and orphanages, but each coin carried a name, each chapel a reminder, built by the grace of the Medici. And through it all, Florence gleamed. Painters mixed pigments beside goldsmiths. Scholars debated beneath frescoed ceilings. The air smelled of olive oil, smoke, and ink. You can almost hear it, the rustle of parchment, the sigh of a candle dying in its holder, the faint hum of a quill across paper as another promise is written into the world. This was not yet the Renaissance, not yet the explosion of art and reason, but its embers were already glowing in the silence of counting rooms, in the minds of men who dreamed of immortality not through blood, but through credit. Outside, the city sleeps. A guard walks past the Duomo, his lantern trembling in the wind. In a window high above the square, Giovanni di Bicci leans over his desk and closes the day's ledger. Somewhere within those columns of numbers, a new age is beginning to take shape, not of war, not of kings, but of faith, balance, and gold. Part 2. Ledgers and Faith. The morning light over Florence was pale and golden, sliding across tiled roofs and silent courtyards. Inside the counting houses, the night's candles had melted into pools of wax, and apprentices swept the floors before their masters arrived. The sound of footsteps and the faint rustle of parchment marked the beginning of another day, a day in which faith and finance would once again meet, uneasily, under the same roof. For in medieval Europe, to lend money was to tempt the soul. The Church had declared it a sin to profit from interest, usury, the crime of selling time itself. Time, said the priests, belonged only to God. But merchants, bound to the tides of trade, knew that time had value, and that without lending and credit, no city could grow. Florence lived in the space between those two truths, a city both pious and practical, where prayers shared the same air as numbers. Giovanni di Bicci understood that tension better than anyone. He attended Mass each morning, bowing his head beneath vaulted ceilings painted with saints. Yet he also carried within him a quiet conviction that gold, when used wisely, could serve both man and heaven. He learned to disguise interest within the language of exchange, a delicate balancing act between salvation and necessity. In the Medici ledgers, transactions never spoke of interest or profit. They spoke instead of compensation for risk, of fees for transport, of gifts in gratitude. The ink told stories that the law could not name. Behind every elegant script was a confession written sideways, a prayer that profit might still please God. When customers entered his counting room, Giovanni greeted them as friends, not clients. He offered them wine, asked after their families, and treated every transaction as a pact of trust. On the walls hung small paintings of saints and crucifixes, not merely decoration, but reminders that fortune was fragile, and faith must always stand beside it. Outside, Florence was changing. The wool merchants of the Arte della Lana Guild sent caravans north toward Flanders, ships left from Pisa loaded with cloth, spices, and hope. The Medici network reached out through these trade routes like a living web, thin, silent, and unbreakable. Letters of exchange traveled faster than any ship. A man could withdraw money in Bruges that he had deposited in Florence months earlier. To most people, it seemed a miracle. To the Medici, it was simply mathematics in motion. And yet, even as wealth grew, the city's conscience whispered. Preachers in the piazzas thundered against greed, warning that gold could not buy heaven. Artists painted the Last Judgment in vivid frescoes, reminding every citizen that death made all accounts equal. But for every sermon against wealth, another church was built with it. Florence was full of paradoxes, stone and silk, sin and sanctity, candlelight and shadow. In the evenings, when the city fell quiet, Giovanni would sit beside his son, young Cosimo, and speak softly of prudence. Gold is not power, he would say, unless it buys trust. He taught his son that a banker's greatest fortune was his reputation, that one broken promise could ruin generations. Cosimo listened, tracing the grain of the wooden desk unaware that his father was shaping the mind of a future prince in all but name. Sometimes, after the household slept, Giovanni would walk through the empty corridors of his home, past shelves of ledgers and coins locked in chests. The air smelled of dust and paper, the scent of memory itself. He would pause beneath a small crucifix, murmuring a prayer not for wealth, but for balance, that the books of his soul might someday close as neatly as the books of his bank. As Florence slept, the Arno glimmered under the moon. Reflections of torches rippled along its surface, like threads of molten gold weaving through the night. In the distance, the bells of Santa Croce called for Compline, the final prayer before rest. Somewhere in that sound, the city seemed to breathe, the sigh of a world learning to live between heaven and credit, faith and calculation. And in a quiet room lit by one last candle, Giovanni de' Bicci wrote the future line by line, hoping that God could read numbers too. Part 3. The house of Medici rises mourning, in Florence broke like a prayer whispered through marble. The sunlight slid down terracotta rooftops and spilled into narrow streets, catching the edges of shop signs, the shimmer of brass scales, the glint of coins changing hands. By now, Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici was no longer just another merchant. He was a name spoken in cautious admiration, a man whose quiet dealings shaped the pulse of the city. He had built his fortune not on conquest, but on trust. In a world where power usually carried a sword, Giovanni's weapon was a signature, his mark beneath a promise. He lent to princes and popes alike, but he never flaunted it. The Medici way was subtle. No banners, no declarations, no marble thrones. Only the calm assurance that those who owed them could not afford to let them fall. Florence, too, had begun to change around him. The city's heart was beating faster. New workshops filled the air with the scent of tanned leather, melting wax, and iron shavings. Goldsmiths engraved coins with ever finer detail, and the young sons of merchants studied not poetry or war, but numbers, the secret alphabet of prosperity. In this new world, humility became the finest disguise for power. Giovanni walked its streets with modest grace. He nodded to artisans, greeted priests with folded hands, and moved through the markets like a man at peace. Yet each bow of the head, each polite smile, hid a sharper calculation. The Medici were no longer traders of cloth. They were traders of loyalty, weaving invisible threads through every guild, council, and chapel. When Florence's ruling class, the Albizzi, tried to tighten their grip, Giovanni did not fight them with force. He offered them partnership, loans to fund their ventures, donations to their charities, gifts for their sons' weddings. And quietly, the balance began to tilt. The Medici family name passed from mouth to mouth, from market stalls to monasteries, until it seemed the city itself had begun to whisper it. His house on Via Larga was modest from the outside, a 2-story building of stone, plain and unadorned. But within, the air shimmered with quiet industry. Clerks bent over ledgers, the sound of quills scratching like soft rain. Couriers came and went, carrying sealed letters across the Alps. The scent of parchment, wax, and oil lamps mixed with that of fresh bread from the kitchen, the perfume of enterprise. At night, when the house emptied and silence returned, Giovanni would pause at the top of the staircase and look down at his workrooms. The flickering oil lamps seemed to breathe. Each chest, each ledger, each locked drawer contained not just money, but the trust of a continent. Florence was no longer a city of artisans alone. It was becoming a city of balance sheets. The hum of looms and hammers was joined by the soft rhythm of calculation. From every corner of the Arno Valley came merchants who wanted their fortunes kept safe, and one name rose, again and again, Medici. But with fortune came risk. Giovanni knew that wealth could turn to envy as quickly as candle wax to smoke. The church still frowned on those who made profit from lending, and rivals in the Albizzi circle looked for any reason to discredit him. To survive, he had to remain a shadow, present, but never proud. And so he practiced what would become the Medici creed: never appear richer than the city itself. He dressed simply, attended every mass, and gave generously to the poor. His public humility became his armor. Behind it, he continued to expand his network, quietly acquiring influence in the papal court, establishing ties with merchants in Venice and Bruges, and teaching his sons to think in centuries, not seasons. Cosimo, the eldest, learned quickly. He watched his father speak in circles, never raising his voice, never making demands, yet always leaving others convinced they had gained the better end of the bargain. Cosimo absorbed the lesson that true power was invisible, like the pulse beneath the skin of Florence itself. When Giovanni grew old, he walked slower through the markets, his hands folded behind his back. He had no need to count coins anymore. The sound of their clink was everywhere, in the bells, the fountains, the laughter of children born into prosperity he had built. And when he died, Florence mourned him not as a banker, but as a benefactor. His funeral was solemn but grand, attended by priests, merchants, and beggars alike. The bells tolled through the valley as if marking the end of one chapter. The humble merchant who had become the architect of Florence's fortune. But his true legacy was not the coins he left behind, nor the marble he funded. It was the son who carried his quiet genius forward. As the last candle burned low in the Medici chapel that night, Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici stood alone in the dark, his father's words echoing in his mind. Gold is a tool, not a throne. Use it to build something that will outlive you. And somewhere beyond the city walls, the wind carried that promise, the beginning of the House of Medici's rise. Part 4. Coins in the chapel shadows. The bells of Florence rang in the dawn, their echoes moving like ripples across the red roofs and narrow alleys. In the early morning light, the city shimmered, marble and dust, incense and coin. Florence had always been a city of faith, but under the Medici, faith began to wear the scent of gold. By the time Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici took his father's place, the family name had become a quiet legend. He inherited not just ledgers and coins, but something far more fragile, the trust of an entire city. He knew that every fortune, no matter how grand, must kneel before appearances, and so Cosimo continued his father's balancing act, one hand clasped in prayer, the other hidden behind the folds of his robe, counting. Florence's skyline was changing. Church towers rose higher each year, their bells calling not only to worship, but to wonder. Behind those sacred walls, frescoes bloomed, angels and saints painted in the glow of candlelight. And beneath those frescoes, in the stillness of chapels and vestries, deals were made. Gold changed hands in whispers. The divine and the earthly became inseparable. Cosimo's banking house served as the unseen foundation for many of these miracles. He financed monasteries, orphanages, and hospitals, all under the sign of Christian virtue. Yet every brick, every fresco, every gleaming chalice told another story, one of quiet investment. A chapel built with Medici money was more than a work of piety. It was an advertisement written in stone. The Medici crest, those 5 crimson spheres on gold, began to appear in strange places, above church doors, carved into tombs, etched discreetly beside images of saints. To the common eye, it was a symbol of generosity. To those who understood, it was a signature, proof that faith and finance now shared the same breath. At the height of his influence, Cosimo was both revered and feared. He could fund a cathedral as easily as he could ruin a rival, but outwardly he remained calm, a man whose wealth seemed to flow not from greed, but from divine favor. His enemies called him Il Vecchio, the Old One, not for his age, but for his patience. He ruled not through decrees, but through timing. In the dim interiors of Florentine chapels, artists worked by candlelight. The smell of wet plaster and pigment filled the air. Brushes whispered across walls as saints took shape from the void. Cosimo would sometimes visit these workshops in silence, his cloak brushing the floor, his eyes tracing every curve and line. He did not see mere art. He saw investment, immortality measured in color and light. One evening, as the light faded beyond the Arno, he stood inside the San Lorenzo church, his family's sacred project. The great architect Brunelleschi had designed its soaring arches, each stone paid for with Medici coin. Candles flickered along the nave, their reflections dancing across marble columns. Cosimo bowed his head, not as a banker, but as a believer. In the hush of the sanctuary, he whispered, "Beauty is another form of trust." Outside, Florence glowed. Merchants closed their shops. The air filled with the scent of olive oil and smoke. Along the Ponte Vecchio, goldsmiths locked their cases and tossed scraps of metal into the river, tiny offerings to fortune. The water caught the last of the sunlight, turning it into threads of molten bronze. At night, when Cosimo returned home, his servants brought him letters from across Europe, from Venice, from Bruges, from the papal court in Rome. The Medici Bank had become the spine of Christendom's economy. Even the Holy See owed them coin, and with that debt came something greater than wealth, silence, because to question the Medici now was to question the very foundations of the church itself. Money flowed like grace, invisible yet everywhere. Priests blessed coins before battles. Monks prayed over financial agreements. Florence had become a city where salvation could be measured in florins. But for all his influence, Cosimo carried a quiet fear. He knew that every fortune, no matter how vast, casts a shadow. The more light his name attracted, the longer that shadow grew. Rivals waited. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the whispers in the Signoria council chambers. They saw not a saint, but a merchant who had outsmarted heaven. One night, as the bells of Santa Croce tolled midnight, Cosimo stood before a fresco still wet with paint. A saint gazed down at him, serene, forgiving, eternal. In the saint's open palm, the artist had placed a single gold coin, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Cosimo stared for a long moment, then smiled. He understood the message and the irony. Even holiness, it seemed, had learned to count. Part 5. Invisible Currencies. The Florence of Cosimo's middle years was a city woven from whispers. Every street held two meanings, one spoken in the open air, another carried quietly in sealed letters and secret ledgers. The scent of ink and wax clung to every workshop. The faint clink of coins followed every prayer. Florence was no longer only a place of art and cloth. It was an empire of trust. What the Medici had built could not be seen. There were no soldiers guarding their fortune, no walls to defend it. Instead, they ruled through invisible lines of promise. Letters of exchange, written in elegant Latin, carried across mountains by riders in heavy cloaks. A piece of paper in Bruges could summon gold from Florence. A signature in Rome could settle a debt in London. This was the birth of modern finance, money without metal, value without weight, a system so fragile it depended entirely on belief. The belief that the name Medici meant safety. Inside the Medici Bank, the rooms smelled of vellum and candle smoke. Quills scraped softly across parchment as clerks recorded each deposit, each conversion, each carefully coded note. The double-entry ledger, an innovation that would one day shape the world, allowed them to see balance not as chaos, but as order. For every debit, a credit. For every loss, a gain. For every sin, perhaps, a prayer. Cosimo understood the poetry of that system. He often said that the books of a good banker were like confessionals, private, sacred, and binding. The same rules that guided faith guided finance, precision, trust, redemption. And just as priests forgave sins, bankers erased debts. Beyond Florence, the network grew. Medici branches opened in Venice, Geneva, Avignon, and Bruges, cities humming with trade and rivalry. Each office bore the same wax seal, the red spheres on gold, the quiet sign that one could do business safely beneath heaven's watchful eye. Couriers traveled day and night, their saddlebags heavy with letters, not coins. Each one carried the weight of promises unseen. To the merchants of Europe, it felt like magic. No need to haul chests of silver across dangerous roads. A single slip of parchment could move fortunes across kingdoms. In the markets of Bruges, cloth traders prayed for Medici approval more fervently than they prayed for good weather. In the courts of popes and princes, their influence ran like an underground river, invisible, unstoppable, and essential. But such a system required faith of its own. If one letter failed to arrive, if one courier was robbed or killed, the illusion could shatter. Entire fortunes could vanish with a misplaced seal. And so, the Medici built their empire on reputation, guarded more fiercely than any fortress. Every debt repaid on time was a brick in that invisible wall. Every favor returned was a cornerstone. Cosimo often walked through the counting rooms, his hands behind his back, reading over the shoulders of his clerks. He spoke softly, asking about rates, routes, and names. He knew that a careless scribe could cost him more than a war. Sometimes he would pause before a window overlooking the Arno, its green surface shining under the sun. "Gold," he would say quietly, "is only gold. Trust, that is the true currency." Outside, the city reflected that same belief. In the marketplaces, voices rose and fell in bargaining songs. The air smelled of spice and sweat, of parchment and pepper. Children played with broken coins, unaware that their city's wealth now floated on words, not metal. The church, too, began to shift. Though its sermons still condemned greed, its vaults filled with Medici florins. Bishops borrowed to build new cathedrals. Abbots sent letters begging for advances to repair abbeys. Faith itself had become collateral. Late one evening, Cosimo sat by candlelight reviewing a letter from Avignon. A merchant had defaulted, not through deceit, but through ruin. He sighed, rubbed his temple, and murmured, "Even promises grow tired." Then he took his quill and crossed out the man's name gently, as if erasing a sorrow rather than a debt. Beyond the open window, the city buzzed faintly, laughter from taverns, footsteps on cobblestones, a lute playing somewhere near the river. It was the sound of Florence breathing, the steady rhythm of commerce disguised as peace. In the darkness, the Medici bank glowed like a hive, every candle a tiny star in a constellation of trust. And across Europe, men who would never meet Cosimo, who would never see his city or touch his gold, slept soundly, because somewhere, in Florence, the Medici had promised that their fortune was safe. Part 6. The Pope's Banker. By the mid-15th century, the Medici were no longer just the bankers of Florence. They had become the keepers of Christendom's purse. From their quiet counting rooms on Via Larga, their reach extended all the way to the Vatican itself. Letters sealed in red wax carried more weight than papal bulls, and beneath the marble vaults of Rome, the voice of the Medici whispered softly through gold. When Cosimo first secured the Vatican account, it was not through flattery or force, but through reliability. Popes changed, tempers flared, kingdoms rose and fell. Yet the Medici ledgers always balanced. The church needed men who could make miracles with numbers, who could turn donations into marble, indulgences into silver, and promises into coin. Florence, the city of faith and finance, had found its most sacred customer. Inside the apostolic palace, priests and secretaries handled scrolls, letters, and florins. The smell of incense mingled with the scent of ink. Every decision, every crusade, every cathedral, Every canonization required funding, and the Medici were there, patient and silent, providing it. When the Pope wanted to repair the basilicas of Rome, it was a Florentine hand that opened the purse. When a cardinal dreamed of a new chapel, it was Medici gold that gave it shape. But this alliance was dangerous. For the Church, money was both necessity and temptation. For the Medici, it was salvation and risk. Cosimo knew that too much power near the altar could draw suspicion, so he disguised his influence beneath gestures of devotion. He funded convents, donated relics, and built libraries for monasteries, acts of charity that softened the gleam of profit. Still, whispers followed him. Priests muttered that no man could serve both God and gold. Sermons hinted at his name without daring to speak it. Yet the Pope himself sent him blessings and commissions, for he knew that the Medici were as indispensable as the Church's own treasury keys. In Florence, this partnership changed everything. Papal emissaries arrived daily, cloaked figures stepping from carriages marked with the Vatican's seal. They brought contracts, letters, indulgences, and secrets. The city's air grew thick with incense and rumor. Ordinary Florentines would pause in the piazzas to watch them pass, whispering to each other, "He works for the Pope's banker." For the Medici, this was the peak of quiet power. Their letters could decide whether a kingdom waged war or made peace. Their loans could crown or dethrone a prince. And still, Cosimo moved through the streets humbly, bowing to priests, speaking softly, offering alms with the same hands that counted papal revenues. In the evenings, he often sat alone in his study, reading reports from Rome by the light of a single candle. The numbers were cold, but behind them lay lives, bishops, artisans, masons, pilgrims. He wondered sometimes if heaven kept ledgers too. If so, how would it record his deeds? Was a hospital's wall worth more than a debt forgiven? Was a chapel's beauty enough to absolve its cost? Outside, the bells of the Duomo rang for vespers, their echoes rolling across the city like slow waves. Cosimo rose, extinguished the candle, and whispered a prayer into the dark. He prayed not for more gold, but for clarity, that his fortune might serve purpose rather than pride. Across the Alps, the Medici network expanded further still. Branches opened in Milan, Geneva, London. Couriers carried messages between monasteries and markets. Every wax seal bore the same crest, 5 red spheres, like drops of blood, or coins, or both. And so the Church and the Medici grew together, faith feeding finance, finance feeding faith. But beneath that harmony ran a quieter current, one that Cosimo could already sense. Money, once meant to serve heaven, was learning to serve itself. And though the candles still burned in chapels across Europe, their flames now reflected the color of gold. Part 7. The Streets of Florence. Florence was never still. Even before sunrise, the sound of footsteps filled its narrow streets, apprentices rushing to workshops, merchants unlocking their shutters, nuns crossing bridges with baskets of bread. The city breathed like a living organism, its pulse steady and strong. Beneath its beauty, beneath the scent of bread and rain and burning olive oil, lay the quiet machinery of money. From his home on Via Larga, Cosimo de' Medici often watched the city awaken. He would open the shutters just as the first light touched the dome of the cathedral. Brunelleschi's masterpiece, paid for in no small part by his family's gold. The air was cool, heavy with mist rising from the Arno. Distant bells marked the hour, and somewhere below, the clatter of wooden carts echoed between the walls. To most Florentines, this was an ordinary morning. To Cosimo, it was a ledger come to life. Each sound, each motion, part of an invisible economy that he had helped to build. The baker buying flour on credit, the mason waiting for his wage from the cathedral fund, the silk weaver praying that his shipment would reach Bruges before winter. Each of them, unknowingly, moved within the shadow of the Medici bank. Florence's power was not in its armies or its walls. It was in its rhythm, the way goods, promises, and prayers flowed together through the day. Even its architecture seemed to echo the logic of trade, courtyards open for meetings, windows wide to let in light, doorways marked with family crests that told their own financial stories. Children played in the piazzas, rolling hoops or chasing doves between market stalls. The smell of cured meat mixed with the perfume of crushed herbs and tallow candles. Monks passed with their robes brushing the ground, muttering prayers for patrons who funded their abbeys. And among all this, the Medici name lingered like perfume, invisible yet unmistakable. Inside the Palazzo Medici, work never truly stopped. Clerks sat at long wooden tables, their fingers stained with ink. Quills moved in quiet rhythm, punctuated by the click of wax seals. Couriers came and went through the courtyard, their boots leaving dusty prints on the stone. The murmur of numbers and names floated up through the halls like distant rain. But Cosimo, though surrounded by wealth, lived simply. He dined on bread, beans, and a little wine. His garments were of fine wool, but unadorned. He understood the lesson his father had left him. Power that shows itself invites envy. So while the Medici fortune reached across Europe, its master appeared to live no differently than any other merchant of Florence. Still, in quiet ways, the family's influence showed. A new hospital funded here, a convent repaired there. Artists paid to illuminate manuscripts for libraries open to the public, acts that bound gratitude to the family name tighter than any contract could. Florence began to whisper not just of wealth, but of wonder, of beauty built from balance sheets. In the market square, you could hear politics as clearly as the toll of bells. Men debated taxes, guild laws, and trade routes while the scent of figs and roasted chestnuts filled the air. And always, somewhere in those conversations, a name surfaced, Medici. For even when they were not present, their influence was. A debt forgiven, a dowry financed, a favor repaid. At night, when torches flickered in the wind, and the Arno reflected their wavering glow, the city took on another life. Musicians played outside taverns, laughter echoed from behind heavy doors. The bankers' clerks, released from duty, strolled the bridges and courtyards. Florence felt eternal, as if the stones themselves held memory. Cosimo sometimes walked among them, cloaked and unrecognized, listening to the rhythm of his own creation. He loved the sound of his city at peace, the hum of prosperity without pride. In those moments, he felt something close to faith, not in gold nor in God, but in the fragile harmony between them. He would stop beside the river, watching reflections of lanterns ripple on the surface. To most, it was just water. To him, it was the bloodstream of the world, carrying wealth, stories, and names that would outlive even the richest men. As he turned back toward his home, the wind carried the smell of wax and smoke from the cathedral's candles. He closed his eyes for a moment and smiled. The city was alive, and in its every breath the Medici could be heard, unseen yet ever present. Part 8. Lorenzo's Golden Age. When Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, came of age, Florence was already a city draped in beauty. Its streets shimmered with marble and music. Its churches glowed with frescoes that seemed to breathe. But under the surface of prayer and poetry ran the same golden current that had begun with Giovanni's ink-stained hands. Now that current found its brightest flame and its most fragile. Lorenzo was born into privilege, but raised to be cautious. He learned Latin and diplomacy, art and arithmetic, the Psalms and the ledgers. From his father, Piero, he inherited a fortune. From his grandfather, a philosophy, rule not with fear, but with favor. Yet Lorenzo carried something neither of them had possessed: charm. He spoke with poets as easily as with popes, and his laughter could soften even his rivals. Florence adored him. They called him Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. He rode through the city not as a ruler, but as a symbol of its confidence. Where Cosimo had walked humbly, Lorenzo shone. Where others hid their wealth, he adorned the city with it. Under his hand, Florence bloomed like spring after a long winter. He gathered artists and thinkers the way others gathered coins. Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and the young Michelangelo found their patrons in the Medici palazzo. Poets recited verses in candlelit gardens, their voices mingling with the scent of jasmine and ink. Philosophers debated beneath frescoes that he himself had commissioned, their words echoing through the marble halls like the hum of a new dawn. Lorenzo believed that beauty could be a form of peace. He saw art not as decoration, but as diplomacy, a gift that spoke in every language. When Florence's rivals in Milan or Naples plotted against her, he sent letters written in verse, laden with gifts of sculpture and song. "Let them love us," he once said, "so they cannot afford to hate us." Yet even amidst the feasts and the frescoes, the air trembled with unease. The church had grown suspicious of Florence's pride. In Rome, Pope Sixtus IV watched the Medici wealth with envy and fear. He saw in Lorenzo not a mere banker, but a rival prince wearing the mask of a merchant. And envy, when dressed in holiness, is a dangerous thing. Still, within Florence's walls, life felt eternal. Markets overflowed with silk and spice. The smell of oranges and oil drifted from open windows. Children played beside fountains carved with Medici emblems. Everywhere, the red spheres of the family crest caught the light. On bridges, on chapels, on coins passed from hand to hand. In the great halls of Palazzo Medici, evenings were symphonies. Lutes and viols played softly, while scholars read from Plato and Virgil. Lorenzo would sit surrounded by friends and artists, his expression serene, his cup of wine untouched for long moments as he listened. He loved knowledge the way others loved gold, and for a time it seemed that wisdom and wealth had found their perfect harmony. But Lorenzo also knew the cost of such beauty. Every fresco required silver, every poet's meal came from coin. The Medici bank strained beneath the weight of its own generosity. Distant branches faltered, debts piled quietly in the corners of rooms scented with incense and paper. Still, he refused to slow the rhythm. "How can we be remembered," he said, "if we build only for profit?" At dawn, he often climbed the steps of San Marco, watching the city below wake to another day. The Arno shimmered, catching the first light. From this height, Florence seemed perfect. Fragile, yes, but perfect. He would whisper a small prayer, not for success, but for continuation, that the art might outlive the coin that paid for it, that the song might echo longer than the breath that sang it. And sometimes, late at night, when the music ended and the halls emptied, Lorenzo would stand before a painting, a Madonna, serene and luminous, and feel both proud and haunted. Was he serving faith through beauty, or beauty through faith? Did Florence worship God, or the glory of its own reflection? Outside, the wind moved through the orange trees in the courtyard, scattering petals across the marble floor. Their scent lingered, soft, sweet, and brief. For though the golden age glimmered brighter than any before, every light cast a shadow, and in the distance, beyond the laughter and song, that shadow was already moving toward Florence. Part 9. Silk, Scent, and Silver Dust. The Florence of Lorenzo's peak was a world made of texture. Silk, velvet, parchment, marble, everything shimmered with touch and scent. It was said that you could walk from one end of the city to the other and never lose the smell of perfume or burning wax. The markets overflowed with goods that came from lands most Florentines would never see. Ships brought spices from Alexandria, dyes from the Levant, and silver from the mountains of Tyrol, all drawn, directly or indirectly, into the Medici orbit. Money traveled not in chests, but in fabrics and scents. A single bolt of silk was worth a small fortune. A vial of cinnamon could pay for a craftsman's month of labor. Florence glimmered like a jewel box, every thread a promise, every aroma a sign of power. And behind it all, unseen but felt, were the quiet rooms where ledgers turned those luxuries into balance and control. The Medici understood what few others did. Wealth was not just possession, but circulation. A coin spent in Florence might end up in Flanders, return through Venice, and find its way back to the city as a Saint S relic or a painter S pigment. Each trade carried a fragment of the world, and each prophet carried a fragment of the soul. In the narrow streets around the Mercato Vecchio, merchants argued over prices while friars passed with baskets of bread. You could hear the clatter of scales, the snapping of bolts of cloth, the laughter of boys carrying letters sealed with red wax. Every smell was distinct: olive oil, wool dye, frankincense, horse sweat, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of coins freshly minted. The air itself seemed to hum with commerce. Inside the Medici Palazzo, Lorenzo's advisors studied these movements as carefully as generals studied maps. They spoke of routes and exchange rates, of ships delayed by storms and caravans slowed by snow. But Lorenzo was interested in more than profit. He saw trade as a web, a way to tie Florence to the world, and the world to Florence. He funded artists in exchange for diplomatic favors, lent money to princes to keep peace, and sent gifts more delicate than treaties: tapestries, manuscripts, carved ivory crucifixes. He had learned his grandfather's lesson: gold wins, battles without blood. But unlike Cosimo, he wanted those victories to be beautiful. He wanted the world to see Florence not as a bank, but as a light. Yet beauty has a cost that does not appear in ledgers. The bank's foreign branches began to suffer. In Bruges, the markets grew quiet. In London, debts went unpaid. Silver mines slowed, and interest rates tightened like a noose. Behind the glittering tapestries and music-filled halls, the Medici clerks struggled to keep the columns aligned. Lorenzo ignored the warnings. He believed that generosity was its own investment, that to fund art, learning, and peace was to serve eternity. But eternity, as Florence would soon learn, pays slowly. Still, in those golden years, the city felt endless. Silk merchants displayed fabrics so fine they shimmered like water. Apothecaries ground spices into powders that perfumed the air for blocks. Goldsmiths carved crucifixes so small and perfect they seemed to breathe. And always, somewhere nearby, the Medici name rested behind the curtain, the unseen hand ensuring that everything from grain to marble continued to flow. On spring mornings, Lorenzo walked through the workshops by the Arno. He loved the smell of dye and damp stone, the chatter of apprentices, the hiss of water boiling with color. Sometimes he would pause beside a loom and run his fingers across the threads, blue, gold, crimson, feeling the same awe a priest might feel before the altar. "Florence," he said once, "is a tapestry woven from faith and ambition. The day we stop weaving, we fade." And yet, even as he spoke, small cracks began to form in that tapestry. The cost of beauty was overtaking its profit. All the while, far beyond Florence's sunlit hills, darker clouds gathered, wars in the south, papal plots in Rome, and in the city itself, murmurs, the faint but growing sound of discontent. But for now, the air still shimmered, Florence still dreamed, and the scent of silk and silver dust still floated through its narrow streets, as if the whole city had been wrapped in a prayer of perfume and light. Part 10. Whispers of Conspiracy. It began, as many downfalls do, not with thunder, but with whispers. In the palaces of Florence, behind curtains heavy with silk, men spoke in low voices. In the candlelit corners of taverns, over wine and bread, names were traded like secrets, and above every rumor floated one name, Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici had turned Florence into a garden of art and reason, but power, even when wrapped in beauty, breeds resentment. To his friends, he was Il Magnifico, the generous Prince of Peace. To his enemies, he was something more dangerous, a man who had made the city his mirror, reflecting only his own vision. The church, too, had grown restless. Pope Sixtus IV, who saw in Lorenzo a rival rather than an ally, conspired in silence. He desired more than spiritual dominion. He wanted Italy itself to bow before his kin. And so, in 1478, in the shadows of Rome and Florence alike, an alliance was forged, a pact sealed not in faith, but in envy. The men who carried it were merchants and nobles, bound by ambition and by fear. Their name would be remembered forever, the Pazzi. They were bankers like the Medici, rivals in trade, rivals in pride. To them, Florence had become a stage with only one spotlight, and Lorenzo stood alone in it. They wanted balance restored. They wanted the Medici humbled. They wanted to cut beauty down to size. Spring came early that year. The city bloomed, unaware of what was coming. Palm Sunday dawned with bells and banners, the streets crowded with worshippers carrying olive branches. The cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, was filled with light and incense. And there, beneath Brunelleschi's great dome, as the choir sang the Kyrie, the conspirators struck. Lorenzo stood beside his brother, Giuliano, unaware that history was about to turn. Knives flashed between prayers. Giuliano fell, bleeding upon the marble floor. Lorenzo was wounded, but escaped, his face marked with cuts, his cloak torn. The sanctuary, once filled with the echo of hymns, now rang with screams. It was not just an attack. It was an excommunication written in blood. Outside, chaos swept through Florence. The bells that once called to mass now called for vengeance. Citizens filled the piazzas, hunting for the conspirators. The city, so long ruled by trust, now trembled with fury. By evening, the Pazzi name was erased, its members executed, their estates seized, their crests torn from walls. Yet even in victory, Lorenzo felt no triumph. He had survived, but Florence had changed. That night, he returned home, his garments still stained, his eyes hollow. He looked at the frescoes his family had paid for, the sculptures, the books, all the beauty he had built, and saw them differently. The candles burned low, their wax pooling like melted gold, and for the first time, Lorenzo wondered whether power, even wrapped in art, could ever be innocent. In the weeks that followed, his enemies fled, and his allies closed ranks. The Medici influence deepened, but so too did the weight of its silence. Lorenzo became more cautious, his laughter rarer, his words slower. He still hosted poets and painters, still funded cathedrals and hospitals, but something had shifted. The glow of his rule had dimmed to a single, steady flame. Florence healed, as it always did. The blood on the cathedral floor was washed away. The bells rang again, and the smell of incense returned. But beneath the perfume of piety lingered something else, the faint, metallic scent of fear. Lorenzo understood now what his grandfather had meant when he warned, "Gold must be silent, or it will be envied." He had made beauty speak too loudly, and though the city still praised him, though artists still sang his name, he knew that envy never sleeps. It only waits. As the sun set over the Arno, turning the river into a strip of red glass, Lorenzo stood at his window, listening to the evening bells. Somewhere below, the streets hummed with life. Merchants, monks, mothers, and children, all unaware of how close their peace had come to ending. He whispered to himself, "Florence lives on faith, not the kind kept in churches, but the kind that binds men to each other. And faith, once broken, is never quite whole again. The city lights shimmered in the distance, fragile and golden, and for the first time, Lorenzo saw them for what they truly were. Not stars of triumph, but candles burning too brightly to last. Part 11. Counting the cost. The years that followed, the Pazzi conspiracy passed like a slow toll of bells. Florence remained beautiful, perhaps even more so, but beneath its marble calm, something fragile had changed. The laughter in Lorenzo's palazzo grew softer. The music still played, but the notes seemed to echo longer before fading into silence. The Medici power had survived, but it no longer glittered. It endured, heavy with caution, as if the city itself held its breath. For the first time, the family that had made Florence a masterpiece began to count not only its fortunes, but its losses. Lorenzo walked the same streets his grandfather once had, but now they felt narrower. Every familiar face seemed older, every greeting quieter. The city's wealth was still vast, yet its faith in wealth had dimmed. Even the sound of coins in the market seemed duller, as if gold itself had grown weary. In the counting rooms of the Medici bank, the ledgers no longer sang. The once perfect columns of figures now leaned with uncertainty. Distant branches had failed, debts went unpaid. London had collapsed, Bruges followed. The invisible web that once connected Florence to the world was fraying, thread by thread. Lorenzo read the reports each morning with a careful calm, his fingers tracing the fading ink. He refused to show despair. He told his clerks, a good name cannot go bankrupt. But in private, he felt the weight of every vanished coin, every failed partner, every betrayal wrapped in politeness. He had spent his fortune not on conquest, but on beauty, and beauty, for all its light, did not return interest. He funded artists, scholars, and builders, believing that the soul of Florence was worth more than silver. Now, as the numbers thinned and creditors pressed close, he began to wonder if even a soul could be mortgaged. The church still smiled upon him, but only faintly. Pope Sixtus IV was gone, replaced by others who remembered every offense and every debt. The alliances that had once kept Florence safe were cracking under the strain of envy and exhaustion. Lorenzo's enemies no longer drew blades, they drew contracts. Still, he continued his patronage. The San Lorenzo complex grew, a monument of quiet devotion. Michelangelo, barely a boy, studied in the gardens Lorenzo had filled with ancient statues and scrolls. The city still saw its ruler as magnificent, but they did not see the sleepless nights, the silent dinners, the man who now prayed more than he planned. He had begun to write poetry again, verses not for glory, but for peace. Lines about the fleeting nature of power, about how beauty must fade as all things do. He wrote, "Time paints all things with the same brush." The banker had turned philosopher. Florence followed his lead. Wealth still passed from hand to hand, but the fever of ambition cooled. People spoke of modesty again, of the virtue of limits, of the danger of pride. The frescoes Lorenzo had commissioned now looked less like triumphs and more like memorials. Even the angels seemed to bow their heads. In the evenings, Lorenzo would walk through his gardens, his steps slow, his cloak brushing the gravel paths. The orange trees still bloomed, their scent thick and sweet, but it reminded him of summers past. He would pause by the marble benches where poets once read aloud and listen to the wind moving through the leaves. Sometimes he thought he could still hear their voices, faint like memory. Inside, the great hall of his home was lined with portraits. Giovanni, stern and wise. Cosimo, patient and watchful. And then his own face, painted younger, brighter, crowned by a light that no longer shone. He studied them often, as if the answers might be found in their painted eyes. He had fulfilled their dream. He had made Florence glorious, but at what cost? The Medici name now carried both reverence and resentment. The city's beauty had been purchased with exhaustion. The banker's book still balanced, but only just. As the candles flickered low, Lorenzo closed one ledger and whispered to himself, "Numbers can measure loss, but not grace." Then he rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the sleeping city. The moonlight washed the rooftops silver. The bells tolled softly across the valley, steady, patient, eternal. And for a moment, the Magnificent felt small, human, and forgiven. Part 12. Beyond the Arno. The Arno River had always been the spine of Florence, a mirror of its moods. In spring, it ran green and full, carrying the scent of earth and rain through the valley. In summer, it slowed to a whisper, reflecting bridges and clouds like a polished coin. And always, beyond its calm surface, the world waited. For the Medici, that world was both promise and peril. Even as Florence itself grew uncertain, the family's influence reached far beyond its walls. Caravans bearing the Medici seal crossed the Apennines. Ships under Venetian flags carried their letters. Couriers rode north toward the markets of Lyon, Bruges, and London. The name Medici had become a kind of passport, a guarantee that promises written in Florence would be honored across Christendom. In Venice, their agents worked beside the salt air and the sound of bells from St. Mark's. In Lyon, gold coins bearing the Florentine lily changed hands in smoky counting rooms. In Geneva, monks blessed their ledgers before closing them at night. And in Rome, where popes rose and fell, the Medici balance sheets outlived them all. But expansion carried its own shadows. Distance made trust fragile. The further the gold traveled from the Arno, the more it depended on human faith, a courier's honesty, a partner's patience, a seal unbroken on a winter road. The Medici Bank was vast, but its heart still beat in Florence, and every branch was only as strong as the faith that bound it back to that single city of marble and smoke. Lorenzo knew this. He had seen letters arrive months late, stamped with rain and dirt, bearing news of losses too distant to mend. He would run his fingers across the ruined ink and say nothing. Somewhere between Florence and Bruges, a merchant had failed to pay, a partner had died, a promise had slipped quietly into dust. No war, no betrayal, only the slow unraveling of a web spun too wide. Still, he could not let go. He believed that connection between peoples, between cities, was the true currency of civilization. He saw trade not as greed, but as a form of conversation, Florence speaking to the world through gold, the world replying with spice, cloth, and faith. In a letter to one of his agents, he wrote, "We are not traders of goods, but traders of trust. Let the name of Florence be spoken in every port, and may it be spoken kindly." And so, the Medici Empire continued to breathe, slower now, but steady. Its roots were arteries across Europe. In Antwerp, merchants toasted with wine bought on Florentine credit. In London, craftsmen paid their apprentices with coins traced back to the Arno. In every ledger, somewhere, the red spheres of the Medici crest appeared beside the numbers, silent proof that even across borders, Florence still held the world's heartbeat. But distance brought danger too. Rival banks rose, hungrier and bolder. Fugger, Strozzi, Sforza, new names, new fortunes, eager to claim the same thrones built on promises. The Medici, proud of their heritage, moved carefully, sometimes too carefully. Their caution, once their strength, became their weakness. In Bruges, a branch closed quietly, its ledgers left unfinished. In Avignon, a partner vanished, taking gold that would never return. The once perfect rhythm of the Medici machine began to falter, a few beats at a time, and yet, through it all, Florence endured. Lorenzo still funded artists, still held festivals that lit the piazzas with laughter and firelight. He refused to let decline show on his face. To the people, he remained Il Magnifico, the golden prince who had turned their city into a living poem. But in the silence of night, when the candles burned low and the river wind moved through the open windows of his study, he would look toward the Arno and imagine his fortune flowing away with it, across mountains, across borders, dissolving into 100 invisible streams. He wondered if it had all been too much, too wide, too fast, too bright. Perhaps every empire, even one built of numbers, eventually reached its horizon. Perhaps gold, like faith, was never meant to travel so far from its source. Beyond the Arno, the world glittered, vast, connected, alive. But to Lorenzo, it no longer looked like triumph. It looked like distance. And distance, he knew, could be the most expensive thing of all. Part 13. The Language of Numbers. Florence was a city that spoke many languages, Latin for prayer, Tuscan for poetry, and the quiet rhythm of numbers for everything else. In its streets, merchants bargained not only with words but with symbols, marks scratched into parchment, sums whispered beneath breaths, gestures of agreement sealed with wax. By Lorenzo's time, the Florentine tongue had two sacred alphabets, one for faith and one for finance. It was said that the city's children learned to count before they learned to write. In the schools behind the market square, tutors traced figures in dust, teaching pupils to reckon with pebbles and tablets. A boy's future could be read in the ease with which he added and balanced, for in Florence, calculation was not a craft, it was destiny. And in the heart of this arithmetic world stood the Medici, whose ledgers had become their own scripture. Page after page, bound in leather and soot-stained at the edges, recorded not just money, but faith. Faith in patterns, in equilibrium, in order. To read those pages was to glimpse the mind of Florence itself, precise, elegant, unhurried. The invention that made it possible, the double-entry ledger, was as transformative as any cathedral dome or poem. Each page carried two columns, debit and credit, loss and gain, sin and redemption. One could almost hear the theology in it, a balance between earthly error and divine mercy. A banker, when closing his books at day's end, performed an act of confession. Lorenzo understood this language better than most poets understood verse. He could look at a page of numbers and see motion, consequence, story. A single entry in Florence might ripple through Venice, touch Lyon, and settle in Rome. Each figure was a pulse in the body of Europe. But numbers, for all their beauty, could not feel. They offered order, not comfort. And in the latter years of his life, as Lorenzo watched his city waver between splendor and strain, he began to sense how fragile even the cleanest balance could be. One evening, he sat in his study surrounded by ledgers, their pages fluttering in the warm wind. The candlelight cast shadows that looked like script across the walls. He opened a volume begun in his grandfather S. time. Yellowed pages filled with handwriting both familiar and strange. Giovanni's neat lines, Cosimo's steady hand, his own, younger, more ambitious. The numbers told a family history more truthful than any chronicle. Each prophet marked a triumph, each loss marked a lesson, each correction a prayer. He ran his finger down the margin and smiled faintly. The ink had faded, but the meaning remained. The Medici had always believed that precision could outlast death. A good ledger, like a good life, should close in perfect balance. Outside, the bells of San Lorenzo chimed softly, not a command, but a reminder. Florence itself moved by measure. Its streets radiated from the cathedral like spokes from a wheel. Its bridges crossed the Arno at careful intervals. Even its beauty followed geometry. But the city's harmony was delicate. Behind every pattern was struggle. Behind every equation, a choice. Numbers could record truth, but they could not forgive it. In those quiet nights, Lorenzo sometimes dreamed of his youth, of poems and music, of bright mornings before the weight of duty. He would wake to the scent of parchment and wax and think of all that could not be counted: loyalty, mercy, time. Even the finest mathematics could not make the soul add up cleanly. When he walked through Florence the next morning, he noticed details he had once ignored: the cracked stone steps of the guild hall, the faded fresco above a baker's door, the children laughing near the fountain, playing with broken tiles. Their games were clumsy and loud, but they had rhythm, the same rhythm as his ledgers, yet freer, unmeasured. He envied them, those children who could still play without balance sheets. For all his art, for all his beauty, for all his books of numbers, Lorenzo felt what every banker eventually must, that the language of numbers is powerful, but it is not enough to describe a life. At dusk, he returned home and closed the old ledger with both hands, gently, as if it were a sacred text. The candle flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the Arno moved as it always had, carrying light, silt, and memory downstream. Somewhere far beyond Florence, the gold of the Medici still flowed in invisible currents. But within the city walls, the man who had once measured the world by numbers now measured it by silence. Part 14. The Taste of Power. Power, like gold, has a flavor. It begins faint, metallic, distant, and then fills the mouth until everything else tastes of it. By the final years of Lorenzo de Medici's reign, Florence had learned that flavor too well. The city still sparkled with marble and song, but beneath its perfume lingered something sharper, the aftertaste of control. Lorenzo, once the poet prince, had become something else entirely, not a tyrant, but a conductor, guiding the city's heartbeat with invisible hands. He knew every rhythm, when merchants could breathe, when guilds should pause, when rivals needed comfort, when allies required reminder. His words carried the weight of coin. His silence could alter the price of wool across Europe. In the council chambers, he listened more than he spoke. Others argued, but Lorenzo's stillness drew attention like fire draws moths. He could end debates with a glance, shift the course of policy with a smile. There was no crown upon his head, no title carved in marble, yet no decision passed without his shadow brushing against it. To the city, he was still Il Magnifico. To those who understood, he was Florence itself. His palace became the true heart of government. At dawn, clerks and ambassadors gathered beneath frescoed ceilings, their murmured greetings blending with the scratch of quills. Lorenzo walked among them like a patient god, his voice calm, his gaze steady. He spoke in sentences that balanced flattery with instruction, generosity with warning. When a merchant faltered in payment, he extended patience. Once, when a rival family hesitated to support a decree, he invited them to dinner, and left them afterward in awe of his grace, or terrified by his politeness. For all its peace, Florence was not gentle. It was a city where every smile carried a ledger behind it, and every friendship bore an interest rate. The guilds watched one another with cautious courtesy. The church nodded approval while counting its own debts. And beneath the glittering surface, men who had once dreamed of art and virtue now dreamed of alliances, appointments, and papal favor. Lorenzo never pretended to be pure. He had long understood that virtue alone could not steer a city. He told his advisors, "If we must rule, let us at least make the rule beautiful." And so he did. He cloaked ambition in frescoes, built diplomacy into architecture, and hid politics inside poems. The cathedral glowed brighter, the libraries grew larger, the festivals grander. Even his manipulation came adorned with grace. In the warm evenings of summer, Lorenzo hosted banquets in his gardens. The air was heavy with roses, grilled meat, and honeyed wine. Music drifted through the orange trees while philosophers debated under torchlight. Princes from Milan, envoys from Naples, scholars from Padua, all came, drawn to the magnet of Florence's elegance, and as they laughed and toasted under the stars, they forgot that every dish, every seat, every gesture was part of a negotiation. "Beauty," Lorenzo once said to a visiting diplomat, is a kind of persuasion. The eye convinces the heart where reason cannot. He smiled when he said it, as if it were a jest, but it was not. It was policy. Still, he paid a price for every triumph. The city's debts deepened. The Medici bank grew fragile. The art that brought him glory bled him dry in gold. To keep Florence loyal, he lent more than he could afford, trusting reputation to protect him longer than arithmetic could. The ledgers no longer whispered certainty. They sighed. Cosimo's discipline had given way to Lorenzo's brilliance, and brilliance, for all its light, burns quickly. There were nights when the Magnificent could not sleep. He would walk barefoot through his halls, the marble cold beneath his feet, passing the frescoes of saints and scholars. He would stop before a painting, perhaps Botticelli's Venus, and stare at her calm, impossible perfection. Then he would whisper to himself, "Power fades like pigment." Even he could see it now. The cracks forming in the paint, the fine dust on the frame. Outside, Florence slept uneasily. The sound of carts in the distance, the hush of the river, the flicker of oil lamps along the bridges, all of it seemed to breathe in rhythm with his thoughts. He wondered if his grandfather, Giovanni, would recognize the world he had built. Would he admire it? Or would he see only a merchant who had turned the sacred act of trust into theater? Yet Lorenzo loved his city too deeply to regret it. He believed that greatness required contradiction. Faith and reason, he wrote once, are the two hands that build civilization. One writes the laws of heaven, the other keeps the books of men. And if those hands sometimes trembled, perhaps it was simply because they carried too much. When ambassadors departed, they carried stories of him back to their courts, of his eloquence, his refinement, his vision. They spoke of Florence as a miracle, a republic without war, a city of scholars under a poet's rule. They did not see the debts, the fatigue, the slow erosion beneath the marble smile. Even perfection has weight. In his later years, Lorenzo grew quieter. He no longer joined the feasts, preferring the company of books. He read Augustine, Plato, the Psalms, searching not for wisdom, but for rest. He began to write letters to his children, warning them not to mistake admiration for safety. "Remember," he told his son Piero, "the city loves us only as long as it needs us. When the wind changes, marble turns to sand." And somewhere in those words lay the unspoken truth of every Medici generation, that power, like gold, begins as a promise and ends as a burden. One autumn evening, as the light waned and the scent of smoke drifted from the city's chimneys, Lorenzo stood at his window, watching the shadows crawl across the Arno. The surface of the river gleamed, molten, restless, eternal. He thought of every deal, every painting, every prayer. He could almost taste it, that faint metallic sweetness that never left his tongue, the taste of power, the price of greatness. The legacy of Florence, and with a weary smile he whispered, "Let the balance close." Part 15. The Fall of the Bank. It began with silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of hesitation. The Medici bank, once a chorus of quills and counting, began to fall quiet. The air inside the great house on Via Larga felt different. Letters arrived less often, couriers rode slower, and the sound of wax seals breaking no longer brought relief, but dread. For decades, the Medici had seemed untouchable. Their ledgers were scripture, their credit as good as faith itself. But faith, like all things, can wane, and when it did, the fall came not with thunder, but with the sound of pages turning. The trouble began far from Florence, in the northern branches where winters were long and patience short. In Bruges, merchants delayed their payments. In London, partners defaulted and disappeared. The trade routes that once carried silk and silver now carried excuses. Each failure was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a pattern no ink could hide. In the counting rooms, the clerks noticed first. A missing sum here, a delayed credit there. Lorenzo read the reports and said little. He had built a life out of confidence, and confidence demands theater. So he smiled at dinners, funded festivals, and ordered new frescoes, even as his ledgers wept in silence. The truth was simple and cruel. The Medici had lent more than they had earned. They had trusted too widely, spent too generously, and believed too deeply in their own legend. The world they had built, a world of letters and promises, began to collapse under its own beauty. In London, the branch failed first. A storm of bankruptcies swept through English merchants. One by one, their debts to the Medici turned to dust. Agents wrote desperate letters to Florence, begging for guidance. Some never received answers. By the time the messages arrived, the accounts were already ghosts. In Bruges, the shutters closed on the once bustling office. The ledgers, thick with foreign handwriting, were packed away into damp cellars where ink turned grey with mold. The Medici seal still hung above the door, but no one entered. The family that had once moved the gold of kings could no longer move its own. And yet, Florence continued to shine. The city's festivals still glowed with lanterns. Its artists still painted. Its poets still sang. Lorenzo refused to let the illusion fade. He believed that beauty could still balance the books of faith. If the numbers no longer aligned, perhaps the soul could make up the difference. But numbers, unlike men, cannot be persuaded. They record what is true, not what is hoped for. Each passing month, the margins grew smaller, the debts deeper. The clerks began to whisper. The apprentices, who once admired the poetry of accounting, now feared the weight of its honesty. Lorenzo's health began to falter. The long years of tension and brilliance had worn him thin. He slept little, ate sparsely, and spent long hours walking the halls of his palace in silence. At night, he would stand before the frescoes he had commissioned, scenes of paradise, painted in radiant blues and golds, and search for some sign of redemption in their calm faces. But even paradise, he knew, was bought on credit. One winter evening, he gathered his remaining advisors. The fire burned low. The room smelled of ink and damp wool. He spoke slowly, his voice faint but steady. "The bank is finished," he said. "Let it end with dignity." No one answered. They knew he was right. A century of careful hands had built an empire of trust. And now, with the stroke of a pen, he would close it. When word spread through Florence, the reaction was not anger, but disbelief. How could the Medici, the city's very heart, be fallible? People spoke of it in whispers, as if naming it aloud might break the spell. But the signs were clear. Fewer carriages at the palazzo gates, fewer clerks in the courtyards, fewer candles burning late into the night. Still, Lorenzo refused to vanish into defeat. He turned his remaining fortune to what he loved most: art, learning, peace. If the Medici could no longer own the wealth of the world, they would own its memory. He invited scholars to his home, filled his gardens with statues and scrolls, and commissioned works that would outlive coin. Let Florence remember, he told his artists, that beauty, once made, is a debt no time can collect. Outside, the Arno carried the reflections of a city both triumphant and tired. Merchants still traded, bells still rang, but something in the rhythm had changed, a note of melancholy woven into the song of daily life. The Medici name, though still spoken with respect, now carried the faint echo of loss. On a spring morning, Lorenzo stood at his window, weak but awake. He watched the city come alive, the same streets his grandfather had walked, the same light gilding the rooftops. The scent of blooming orange trees drifted through the air. He turned to his steward and said softly, "Perhaps this is balance, to give back what we borrowed." Later that year, he would die in the same room where he had once written poetry by candlelight. The bells of Florence tolled slowly, their echoes folding over the river. The people mourned him, not as a banker, but as a patron, the man who had made their city shine brighter than any other in Christendom. and somewhere, deep in the archives of the Medici Bank, the last ledger was closed, its ink faded, its margins frayed, its sums uncertain. But between those brittle pages, history itself had been written. The Medici had fallen. Yet in their fall, Florence remained eternal. Part 16. Blood and Blessings. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, Florence did not fall silent. It exhaled. The bells tolled softly through the mist, echoing against marble walls that he himself had helped raise. Merchants paused in their counting rooms, monks whispered prayers, and artists laid down their brushes. The city had lost its soul, but not its memory. And in that memory, the Medici lived on. Yet the fortune Lorenzo left behind was not gold, but names. The family had given Florence its splendor, but the world beyond the Arno was changing. Spain and France hungered for Italy. The papacy, restless and ambitious, reached for kingdoms as if they were altars. In that new world, the Medici would not survive as bankers. They would have to become something holier. Their rebirth came through blood. Lorenzo's descendants turned from commerce to clergy, from ledgers to liturgy. It began with Giovanni, the son of Lorenzo's lesser branch, a boy raised among candle smoke and Latin hymns. He was clever, patient, and quietly certain that destiny favored his bloodline. Where his ancestors had balanced columns of numbers, he would balance the souls of Europe. As the 15th century bled into the 16th, Florence itself wavered. Lorenzo's death had left a vacuum that others rushed to fill. His son, Piero, called the Unfortunate, lacked his father's calm hand. He made enemies of allies, trusted the wrong men, and surrendered the city to the advancing armies of France. Florence turned on him as quickly as it had once adored his father. The Medici were driven out, their palaces looted, their symbols scraped from walls. The family that had once lent to kings now begged refuge from them. And yet, exiles have long memories. Giovanni grew to manhood not as a merchant, but as a churchman, a cardinal before his 30th year. He studied scripture, yes, but also strategy. He had learned his ancestors' lesson, that gold is not the only currency worth counting. Power, faith, forgiveness, these two could be exchanged. In the flickering candlelight of Rome, he plotted the Medici return. Meanwhile, Florence convulsed. A preacher named Savonarola thundered against sin and splendor alike. He called Lorenzo's Florence a Babylon of vanity and flame. Under his sermons, the city burned its luxuries, paintings, jewelry, manuscripts, in great pyres called bonfires of the vanities. The scent of burning parchment and silk filled the air. For a time, Florence turned away from beauty, seeking purity instead. But purity, like wealth, cannot feed a city. And when the hunger returned, so too did the longing for the Medici. In 1512, with papal blessing and foreign armies at their back, the family returned. Giovanni entered Florence not as a banker, but as a cardinal of the church. And soon, far more than that. Within a year, he was elected Pope Leo X. For the first time, the red spheres of the Medici crest hung not over a counting house, but over the gates of heaven itself. Rome changed beneath his hand. The marble streets once stained with pilgrims' dust now gleamed with gold. Leo's papal court was a theater of magnificence, choirs, banquets, and endless commissions. He revived the Medici tradition of patronage on a grander scale, summoning Raphael and Michelangelo to adorn the Vatican. Where Lorenzo had built Florence, Leo built Rome. But the spirit of the family, its blend of generosity and indulgence, followed him still. The papal treasury, like the Medici Bank before it, was not infinite. Leo spent as he pleased, certain that art itself was a form of prayer. He sold indulgences to fund his dreams, small parchments promising remission of sins for a price. They were printed, signed, and sold across Europe. Coins clinked in the hands of priests as salvation became an industry. And far to the north, in a monastery in Germany, A monk named Martin Luther read one of those indulgences and began to tremble with rage. The Reformation had found its spark, and it glowed with Medici gold. Still, Leo X ruled as his ancestors had, with faith in display. He believed that beauty could sanctify even excess. He once said, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And he did. Banquets lit by hundreds of candles, music that filled the halls of St. Peter's, gifts sent to every corner of Christendom. Rome had never glittered so brightly, nor stood so close to fire. When Leo died in 1521, he left behind no heirs, no gold, only monuments. But the Medici bloodline had not finished its work. Another cousin, Giulio, soon ascended as Pope Clement VII, the second Medici to wear the fisherman's ring. The family that had once sold credit to priests now commanded the throne of Peter itself. What began in ink and coin had ended in mitres and blessings. Yet even papal robes cannot hide the fragility of fate. Clement's Rome would burn during the sack of 1527, its treasures plundered by soldiers who cared nothing for bloodlines. He fled through secret corridors while the city screamed around him, proof that divine favor is no guarantee of safety. And still, the Medici endured. For every ruin they suffered, they built anew. For every exile, a return. Their resilience was their faith, not in heaven, but in themselves. They no longer needed ledgers. Their signatures were carved in stone and sanctified in prayer. When Clement finally returned to a broken Rome, he stood before the ruined basilicas and whispered, "Everything built by man requires rebuilding." It was both confession and prophecy, for the Medici name that had once shimmered in ink and candlelight now glowed in stained glass and marble, sanctified by the very church that had once called them sinners. Part 17. The Art of Immortality. Long after the quills had dried and the ledgers had closed, the Medici name lived on, not in numbers, but in marble, paint, and stone. Their fortune, once measured in florins, was now measured in beauty. Rome and Florence alike became their open-air cathedrals, each wall, each dome, each brushstroke whispering the same silent creed, that art could do what money never could, make time pause. It was Pope Clement VII, weary from exile and ruin, who turned again to beauty for redemption. He called upon the greatest artists of his age, men whose names would one day eclipse those of kings. Michelangelo, Raphael, Cellini, all found their way to Medici halls, summoned by letters sealed in crimson wax. Where others sought salvation through prayer, the Medici sought it through creation. In Florence, the city of their ancestors, the air itself seemed to shimmer with revival. The bells of San Lorenzo rang once more over the workshops where marble dust hung like sacred smoke. In those dim studios, sculptors and painters labored not merely for pay, but for immortality. Every chisel's strike was a heartbeat, every layer of pigment a prayer. And behind it all, the Medici stood, invisible patrons guiding the light. Michelangelo, who had once carved David in defiance of tyrants, now turned his hands to the Medici chapel. He worked in near solitude, the room dim but alive with the smell of stone and sweat. There he shaped the tombs of Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, not as mere graves, but as meditations on time itself. 2 marble figures lay upon each sarcophagus, dawn and dusk, night and day, their bodies twisted as if caught between sleep and awakening. The stone seemed to breathe. In their silence, one could almost hear Michelangelo's thought, that life is a brief light between 2 shadows. He once said of his work, "I carve until the angel appears." And in those tombs, the angels of the Medici finally did. In Rome, the family's influence took grander form. St. Peter's Basilica, that vast labyrinth of faith, rose beneath Medici eyes. Raphael painted the papal apartments with scenes of philosophy and reason. turning theology into theater. Benvenuto Cellini cast molten bronze into the shape of myth. Every brushstroke, every sculpture, every note of choir and organ carried the echo of Medici patronage. To walk through these cities was to walk through their afterlife. Even now, centuries later, one can trace the pulse of their ambition in the rhythm of the stones. Florence, domes glowing like suns at dusk, Rome's corridors lined with faces that refuse to age. The Medici had discovered what every mortal dreams of, not how to live forever, but how to be remembered as if they had. Their transformation was complete. Where Giovanni and Cosimo had counted coins, their descendants now counted artists. Each generation added to the archive of eternity. Their chapels became galleries, their palaces libraries of light. And though their bloodline would one day thin and fade, the world they commissioned could not. It was carved too deeply, painted too vividly, sung too sweetly. Even their failures gleamed in memory. The broken banks, the exiles, the betrayals, all were softened by the glow of the art they left behind. Time, ever the cruelest creditor, seemed to forgive them. The Medici, once accused of greed, were now remembered for grace. But beauty, like wealth, carries its own form of solitude. Clement VII, surrounded by frescoes and splendor, often prayed alone. He would walk through the Vatican gardens at dusk, the air thick with cypress and incense, and listen to the fountains echo in the twilight. The art that bore his family's name outlived every ally, every rival, every saint and sinner alike. He began to sense that immortality was not peace, but permanence, a kind of stillness that no living man could inhabit. Meanwhile, in Florence, the younger generations lived amid ghosts of grandeur. Children of bankers and bishops grew up beneath ceilings painted by geniuses, hearing stories of ancestors who had built cathedrals as if they were mere accounts to be settled. The family still held power, but it was softer now, a power of presence, not persuasion. The city no longer feared them. It simply existed within their shadow, as one might live beside a mountain. And yet, what a shadow it was. Florence glowed in the Renaissance like a candle reflected in 1,000 mirrors. Music drifted from chapels, light poured through stained glass, and even the poorest beggar walked streets paved by Medici mercy. Their legend had become inseparable from the city itself. In one of his letters, Michelangelo wrote of the Medici, "They do not die, they turn to marble." He meant it as both praise and warning, for in their quest to escape the limits of flesh and fortune, the Medici had become their monuments, immortal but unmoving. Every statue they commissioned now looked back at them with serene judgment, every fresco a reminder that beauty demands sacrifice. When Clement died in 1534, Rome mourned him as it had once mourned Lorenzo. The bells tolled again, rolling through the city like slow waves. Another chapter closed, another marble name added to the long list of the blessed and the flawed. And in Florence, the chapel Michelangelo had built stood silent, its marble figures forever caught between dawn and dusk. The dust in the air glittered in shafts of morning light. No one could say whether it was marble powder or the last breath of the Medici dream. But perhaps that was the point. They had turned their story into something beyond themselves, a story not of wealth, but of creation, not of conquest, but of permanence. And in that fragile perfection, they had found what they had sought since Giovanni's first quill touched parchment: immortality, not written in ink, but carved in stone. Part 18. The Weight of Gold. Gold has no scent, yet the world learned to breathe it. From the bells of Florence to the altars of Rome, from the courts of France to the markets of London, its invisible perfume lingered in every hall of power. What began as trust written in ink had become the quiet law of civilization. The Medici had not merely built a bank, they had built the modern soul. By the 16th century, Europe was learning to measure worth not by lineage, but by ledger. A noble's word no longer outweighed a merchant's credit. Princes borrowed from bankers, popes bargained with painters. The sacred and the secular had become indistinguishable, two hands drawing from the same purse. Yet beneath that harmony, something deeper was shifting. Where once men confessed sins, they now calculated them. Where salvation had been a mystery, it was now a contract. Every favor bore a price. Every blessing carried interest. Even time, that most divine of gifts, could be bought, paid for with indulgences stamped in Rome and printed across the continent. The Medici had not created greed. They had simply refined it. They had taken humanity's oldest hunger and given it structure, turning chaos into balance sheets, faith into figures, uncertainty into exchange. And for a time, it worked. Europe prospered. Its cathedrals grew higher, its paintings brighter, its ships braver. The world expanded, and in its expansion, the weight of gold became the rhythm of progress. But progress is a quiet burden. It does not ask permission, it only multiplies. With every coin minted, a piece of conscience melted with it. Monarchs taxed the poor to fund wars in God's name. Explorers crossed oceans in search of gold rather than salvation. Cities rose like palaces and fell like debts unpaid. And behind it all, the lessons of Florence lingered. That fortune was not divine favor, but human invention. Even the Church, the great keeper of heaven's account, could not escape the logic it had once condemned. The Vatican itself became a treasury, its walls heavy with frescoes, its vaults heavier still. Pilgrims knelt before altars gilded with the same metal once weighed in Medici scales. The line between devotion and display blurred until even saints seemed to shimmer with currency. The thinkers of the New Age began to notice. Erasmus wrote of folly, Luther wrote of corruption, Machiavelli, himself a Florentine, wrote of necessity. Each, in his own way, tried to decipher the new faith, not in God, but in order, in credit, in power. The Renaissance had promised rebirth, but in its radiance, Europe discovered a new fragility, the soul's uneasy alliance with wealth. Florence, meanwhile, had grown quieter. The city that had once dictated the heartbeat of Christendom now listened instead. Its river flowed past the old Medici palaces, past workshops where dust covered half-finished sculptures. The sound of chisels was fainter now, the hum of trade gentler. The age of discovery had carried commerce elsewhere, to ports, to empires, to seas the Medici would never see. And yet, even as their influence waned, their invention endured. Every promissory note, every merchant's ledger, every printed bill that crossed a counter carried the echo of their method. The double entry system, that perfect mirror of loss and gain, had become the world S language. For every debit, a credit. For every shadow, a light. A moral symmetry disguised as mathematics. Sometimes, late at night, priests in Rome still prayed over coins before collecting them in alms. In their quiet hands, the gold felt warm, as if it still remembered the fires of Florence, the voices of men who believed that wealth could serve beauty, that profit could redeem faith. They did not realize that even their prayer was part of the same balance, the hope that something eternal could still be purchased with good intention. And perhaps it could. For though money had reshaped the world's heart, it had also built its beauty. Without gold, there would be no marble dome over St. Peter's, no frescoed ceilings glowing like sunrise, no music filling the chapels with trembling harmony. The Medici, for all their contradictions, had given humanity a strange inheritance, a world where sin and splendor walk hand in hand. To weigh gold, after all, is to weigh humanity itself. Its brilliance blinds and blesses in equal measure. It reveals what we desire most and what we fear to lose. It builds cathedrals and ruins, crowns and debts, art and empire. And through it all, it reminds us that nothing of value is ever truly free. By the end of that century, Florence stood not as a ruler, but as a relic. Its streets remained beautiful, but they carried the melancholy of memory. Visitors walked through its piazzas and whispered of the Medici as if they were myths. Some said they had been chosen by God. Others said they had merely learned to play his role too well. But in the stillness of the evening, when the bells of San Lorenzo tolled and the Arno reflected the last light of the sun, the truth seemed simpler and heavier. The Medici had not conquered the world. They had taught it how to measure itself, and that, more than any empire or painting, was their eternal weight. Part 19. Echoes across time. Centuries passed, but Florence never forgot. The marble darkened, the frescoes faded, and yet the city still breathed in the rhythm of its past. Each footstep on its cobblestones carried an echo of quills scratching parchment, of coins sliding across oak desks, of prayers whispered between ledgers. The Medici were gone, but their pulse remained, steady as the river beneath the bridges they had built. In the markets where wool and silk once traded hands, tourists now wandered, tracing the same paths that merchants once took toward fortune. The banks bore new names, the coins new faces, but the pattern was the same: trust and exchange, promise and belief. The invisible system Giovanni had begun beneath candlelight now circled the globe, unseen yet omnipresent. The Medici no longer owned the gold, but they had written the grammar of how it moved. The double-entry ledger had become the foundation of modern finance, the silent mathematics that underpinned every transaction. Its logic reached beyond parchment and quill, flowing into ledgers of glass and code, into screens where numbers flicker faster than any hand could write. Somewhere, deep in that digital hum, the old symmetry survived: credit and debit, profit and loss, faith and doubt. Even the banks of New York, Zurich, and London, without knowing it, spoke Florentine. Art, too, bore their echo. The Medici patronage had taught Europe that beauty was not a luxury, but an economy. They proved that culture itself could be capital, that a painting could buy peace, that a cathedral could lend power, that the soul could be balanced like a book. Every museum today is a descendant of their idea, that a collection, like a ledger, records the worth of a civilization. Walk through the Uffizi gallery, their gallery, and the ghosts are everywhere. Botticelli's Primavera, shimmering with eternal spring, Leonardo's calm sketches of the human form, Raphael's gentle faces, all touched by Medici coin. They gaze back through time, their pigments still bright, their silence still eloquent. They are the interest accrued on the Medici's greatest investment, memory, but their echoes reach beyond beauty. Politics itself carries their signature. The balance between appearance and power, between image and control, it was the Medici who perfected it. Long before modern states, they understood the theater of influence. They knew that people could be ruled by belief as easily as by law. Their diplomacy, subtle and glittering, became the model for centuries of rulers who learned that perception is the most enduring currency of all. Even the language of business bears their shape. Words like credit, from credere, to believe. Words like bank, from the benches where Florentine merchants once sat along the Arno, counting coins and signing promises. Each syllable carries the weight of a world first built in the flicker of Florentine candlelight. And in every ledger, every signature, every handshake sealed across continents, there lies a faint trace of their creed, that value is not in the object, but in the faith two people place in each other. It was a radical idea in the 15th century. It remains radical still. Yet history, like fortune, is cyclical. Empires rise, fall, and rise again in new forms. The Medici once ruled through parchment, now men rule through screens. Numbers flow not by horseback but by electricity, but the illusion remains the same, that something invisible can bind the world together, that faith in a system can be stronger than the walls of any fortress. Florence itself has become a quiet witness. The palazzo on Via Larga still stands, its stone cool and patient. The chapels where Michelangelo's figures rest still smell faintly of dust and incense. Every evening the light falls across those statues, night and day, dawn and dusk, and their marble faces catch it like memory catching breath. The city feels timeless not because time has stopped, but because it has been recorded so precisely that it cannot escape. Modern visitors look up at those walls and see only beauty, but the Medici would have seen more. They would have seen accounts, promises, debts repaid in admiration. Every awestruck gaze is a form of payment. Every photograph a continuation of the trade they began, giving something intangible in exchange for something eternal. And though centuries have washed away their voices, the logic they built still hums beneath the surface of daily life. Each time a card swipes, a loan is signed, a work of art is funded, or a city invests in its image, a quiet Florentine principle awakens. That belief, once written down, becomes real. It is said that ghosts linger where they are remembered. If that is true, then Florence is a city entirely made of ghosts, of artists, of merchants, of poets, and popes, of Medici upon Medici, whose breath once warmed these same stones. Their whispers live in the echoes of footsteps through the Uffizi, in the scent of candle wax in San Lorenzo, in the flicker of sunset over the Arno. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it, the rustle of parchment, the click of coins, the turning of a page, a sound older than any nation, a rhythm still pulsing through every exchange of trust, the heartbeat of the Medici, faint but endless. Part 20. The last candle night settles over Florence. The river lies still, a sheet of black glass beneath the bridges. The domes and towers gleam faintly in the moonlight, familiar silhouettes against a sky that has watched them for 600 years. Somewhere, a single candle still burns inside the Medici chapel, its flame flickering in the hollow gaze of Michelangelo's marble saints. It trembles, but it endures. In that light, you can see everything that remains: stone and paint, faith and calculation, beauty and burden. The Medici are gone, but their shadow lies across the world, soft as memory, heavy as gold. They began with a quill and a ledger, a merchant bending over parchment, counting coins by candlelight. From that small act of trust, they built cathedrals, crowned popes, and remade the rhythm of civilization. They taught the world that numbers could be holy, that art could be power, that beauty could be as persuasive as any prayer. And when their coins turned to dust, their ideas endured. The way we borrow, the way we build, the way we measure value, all carry their quiet fingerprints. Every bank, every gallery, every foundation that links wealth to meaning still walks in their echo. History remembers their triumphs and their sins in equal measure. They were devout and indulgent, generous and vain, faithful and ambitious. They sought heaven through marble and salvation through beauty. And perhaps that is why they fascinate us still, because in them we see ourselves. The same longing for permanence, the same need to leave behind something that time cannot erase. The candle flickers lower. Its wax pools across the floor like melted gold, shimmering against the cold stone. Above it, the marble figures of dawn and night watch in silence, their stillness almost human. Outside, the bells of San Lorenzo toll once, then fade into the dark. Florence sleeps, as it has for centuries, dreaming in the language the Medici wrote, the language of trust, of balance, of beauty. You can almost imagine Giovanni de' Bicci again, seated at his desk by lamplight, his quill tracing the first careful line of a ledger that would outlast his bones. You can hear Cosimo murmuring his quiet counsel, Lorenzo whispering poetry to the city, Clement raising his hand in blessing. The centuries fold like pages, and all that remains is a single truth, written softly between them, that faith, in any form, is a kind of currency, and that every promise kept is worth more than gold. The candle burns lower still. Its flame dances once, twice, and then steadies, as if unwilling to die. It knows what the Medici knew, that even the smallest light can survive in the memory of those who remember to look for it. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the quiet streets of Florence, stop a moment beneath the night sky. Listen to the faint hum of the city, the soft rush of the Arno below the bridges. Somewhere in that sound is the echo of ledgers closing, of prayers whispered, of dreams financed into eternity. Somewhere in that sound, the world remembers them. Before we say goodnight, a small note. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, consider subscribing and turning on the bell. I upload new calm journeys through history every day, each one a story to fall asleep to. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's comforting to know that somewhere under another sky, someone else is falling asleep to the same quiet light. Until next time, rest well and let history keep its watch. The world remembers you.